the important thing about genealogy is you start with where you are today and you go back generation by generation. So you usually start with where you're living or where your parents are living or where your grandparents are living, and you start in the local records. You go to the county courthouse, you check the local library. Libraries are very helpful because many of them have the local newspapers on microfilm, and newspapers are very important because it's the best place to find obituaries. Sometimes people forget that this country was formed not on the big New York Times or Boston Globe, but on community newspapers that were usually published weekly. And the local newspapers needed news, so each of the communities usually had a little local news column, and it's amazing how much information you can find, not just when someone died, but who came in from out of town to attend the funeral, and of course check the cemeteries. There's wonderful information there. And then expand from the county and you go to the state level. So at the state level you often have the vital statistics that the state kept. You may have naturalization records. You always have a state library. You usually have state archives that have corporate records if your family happened to be involved in a business. So you kind of work your way up. Then the next level is regional. And when you get to regional, there are a number of wonderful libraries that focus on genealogy across the country. The Fort Wayne Public Library, the Newberry Library in Chicago, the Dallas Public Library. And so the more comfortable people become, they go looking for these additional sources. And then you get to the national level, and that's Washington, D.C., and the National Archives and the Library of Congress and the DAR. And what's wonderful about the National Archives that most people don't know is they have this network of regional archives. And then, of course, there's the wonderful Family History Library in Salt Lake City. If you go to Salt Lake City to do research, you can be working Illinois, and then you find, oh, they lived in Ohio before that, and instead of getting in the car and having to drive to the next state, you just go back to the card catalog and you pull a different set of microfilm, and you're all of a sudden in Ohio and working Ohio. So it is a wonderful opportunity to really do concentrated research. I always say there's 3 phases to genealogy. The first one is most people begin researching their surname. That's their identity, and they want to know who they were, and that's where they begin. And then as they do this a while and they find that they can find real records about their ancestor, whether it's a military record or a marriage record, then it kind of bites them. And then they say, well, gee, I want to know about my mother, or I want to know about my grandmother, and the extension continues. And those are harder to research, by the way, because the further back you go, if you go back 100 years, women didn't hold property in their own name, and that becomes part of the challenge. But anyway, the first phase is you do your surname, and then you start filling in your chart. You know, you have a pedigree chart, and you start going down one line, and then you see that half of the page is empty, so you start working on that. So that I call it's the second phase, and then you start filling out all the names, and that tells you where they lived. You start really starting to identify with the geography. What states did they come from? What was the migration pattern in which they moved? That's the second phase. And some people never get beyond that. Well, I'm a third phaser, I call it. And that's when I really want to know who these people are. I want to know what their occupation was, where they went to church. Often we have voter records. What was their political party? How did they live? I really get involved in the vital records and the death records because I live in a family where there's always been heart disease and there's been diabetes. So I really want to know death records, what was cause of death. I also in my family have a situation where for 3 generations the women never lived to be 40 years old. So I like to know what was the cause of death and what might have been inherited through the families. People generally start by belonging to a local society. It's either one where they're living now, so they can go to some local programs and learn some of the skills and tools, or they may belong to a society where their family used to live and they get a newsletter and it helps let them know what records are available. The difference with NGS is we're the longest national organization that doesn't have any geographic connection. And so we're about telling people what records are available, how to use those records, how to document your research, how to tell your story. And it's about education. It's about giving people the tools and letting them know that it's not a stagnant hobby. Because of the internet and because of imaging, there are so many new documents coming available every year, and so it's a constant learning to let people know that more and more of the information about their family is there for them to find and discover. It's like being a detective. You start out wanting to know something usually about a generation or two back, and then you're so surprised about how many records are available that then that bug has bitten you, and your curiosity just takes off, and you just go more and more and more and deeper and more relatives.